Anniversaries are supposed to be a celebration of love, trust, and shared memories. But sometimes they reveal the truths we never wanted to face. What began as a dream getaway, carefully planned to mark a milestone in marriage, quickly turned into a nightmare that peeled away the polished surface of loyalty. Beneath the laughter, the romantic dinners, and the picture-perfect smiles, a darker truth lurked, one that could shatter not just a relationship, but the very foundation of trust. When secrets rise in the most unexpected of places, revenge doesn't just become an option, it becomes a weapon sharpened by betrayal. Daniel had spent weeks preparing for this anniversary trip, convinced that nothing could go wrong when love was the center of it all. At 32, he was in what most would call the golden years of his marriage, a point where comfort and routine blended with intimacy and shared memories. He wanted this trip to be a reminder of the vows they once exchanged, a chance to step away from the noise of everyday life and relive the magic of when everything felt simple. He booked a secluded cabin with a view that stretched endlessly into the horizon, the kind of place that promised serenity, where the world's chaos couldn't intrude. For Daniel, this wasn't just a vacation, it was a carefully constructed celebration of loyalty, a stage set to bring him and his wife closer than ever. He imagined candlelit dinners, whispered conversations, and laughter echoing into the night, the sort of perfection that would etch itself into memory for years to come. In the days leading up to the trip, Daniel noticed a lightness in his wife's tone whenever they spoke about it. She seemed excited, eager even, and her smile carried a glimmer that reminded him of the early years when they first fell in love. That expression gave him comfort, a reassurance that all his planning was worth it. He had gone out of his way to pick the little details, her favorite wine tucked in his bag, a playlist filled with songs from their dating days, and even the scent of lavender candles she always adored. For Daniel, these weren't just gestures. They were proof that he remembered, that he cared enough to hold on to the fragments of who they used to be. Every detail felt like a thread woven into a tapestry of love, each piece carrying the weight of intention. As they set out, the atmosphere carried a softness that was almost cinematic. The road stretched endlessly before them, winding through tall trees and open fields, the air humming with the promise of escape. Daniel kept glancing at her, stealing moments to watch her eyes dance as the sunlight streamed in through the window. He felt proud, not just of the trip, but of the life they had built together. In his heart, this getaway wasn't just an anniversary gift. It was a reaffirmation, a way of saying, "I still choose you," without needing to put it into words. He believed in what they had, in the bond that had weathered storms and still held strong, and he trusted that this journey would strengthen it even further. When they arrived at the cabin, Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction. It was even more beautiful than the pictures had shown. Nestled among towering pines with a lake shimmering in the distance, the place radiated tranquility. The air smelled of fresh earth and pine needles, a reminder of simpler times when life felt slower and more forgiving. His wife seemed delighted, running her fingers along the wooden railings of the porch, her eyes widening at the view. That reaction alone felt like a reward to Daniel, proof that he had made the right choice. He carried their bags inside, watching her wander the cabin with childlike curiosity, as though she had stepped into a world built just for them. The first evening unfolded with an ease Daniel hadn't felt in a long time. They sat on the porch, glasses of wine in hand, the sky painted with the hues of a setting sun. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was comforting, like a shared secret only they could understand. He caught himself smiling as he watched her, thinking about how lucky he was to have her by his side. There was no hint of distance, no shadow of doubt in his heart. For Daniel, this was everything he had hoped for. Quiet moments stitched together with love, a chance to breathe and remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. That night, as they shared a simple dinner by candlelight, Daniel felt a warmth spread through him, the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. He raised his glass, toasting to love, to loyalty, to the years behind them and the years still ahead. His wife clinked her glass against his with a soft smile, and for a fleeting second, everything felt perfect, untouched by the flaws of reality. Daniel believed in that perfection with every fiber of his being. He believed in the beauty of the moment, the sincerity of her smile, the comfort of the silence that wrapped around them. He couldn't have imagined that beneath the perfection he worked so hard to create, something darker was quietly waiting. The trip, crafted as a symbol of love, held within it the seeds of truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew. Daniel remained blissfully unaware, basking in the illusion he had built, blind to the cracks that were slowly forming in the foundation he trusted so deeply. Daniel woke the next morning to the sound of birdsong echoing through the trees, a kind of peace he rarely felt back in the city. The crisp mountain air drifted through the window, brushing against his skin as he lay in bed, watching the soft glow of morning light creep across the cabin walls. For him, this was everything he had imagined, the perfect beginning to what should have been a flawless anniversary trip. He turned to look at his wife, expecting to see her curled beside him in the same serenity, but the space beside him was empty. A faint unease stirred in his chest, though he quickly brushed it off, telling himself she was probably just out on the porch, soaking in the view. Still, he couldn't ignore the small disappointment of waking up alone on the very morning he had hoped to share together. When he found her outside, she was already dressed, sitting cross-legged on the porch with her phone in hand. The way her eyes darted across the screen, the slight curve of a smile tugging at her lips. It was subtle, but Daniel noticed. She looked up quickly when she heard the door open, slipping the phone into her lap with a casualness that felt just a little too rehearsed. "You're up late," she teased, her tone light and playful. Daniel forced a smile, pushing down the flicker of unease that had risen inside him. He reminded himself that suspicion had no place on a trip meant to celebrate love. Still, the image of her hidden smile lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. Throughout the day, Daniel tried to shake off the strange feeling. They went hiking, followed winding trails through the forest, and laughed as they tried to navigate the steep paths together. For the most part, it felt genuine, like the moments he had so carefully envisioned. Yet there were little things. Her distracted gaze when he spoke, the way she checked her phone more often than usual, even when they were surrounded by the breathtaking silence of nature. Daniel told himself not to read too much into it, but the awareness gnawed at him. Subtle changes like these, ones he might have overlooked back home, stood out more sharply against the backdrop of the cabin's isolation. By evening, the sense of dissonance grew stronger. As they prepared dinner together, Daniel noticed her laughter felt a shade too thin, her eyes drifting away from his more often than they met them. When he brushed his hand against hers while passing a dish, she pulled away quickly as though startled. It was such a small thing, something that could easily be explained away. But to Daniel, it echoed louder than any words. The intimacy he had envisioned, the closeness he had planned for, seemed to waver beneath a surface tension he couldn't quite name. Later, as they sat by the fire, Daniel tried to ease the unease by sharing stories from their early years, moments he thought would spark nostalgia and laughter. And at first she did laugh. She nodded, she smiled, she even leaned against him for a brief moment. But then, when he glanced down, her phone was glowing again in her hand, half hidden beneath the blanket. The screen's light illuminated her face in a way that twisted Daniel's stomach, because her expression wasn't one of boredom or distraction. It was one of delight, a soft, private joy that had nothing to do with him. The subtlety of it all was what made it worse. There were no harsh words, no obvious signs of betrayal, just these tiny cracks that Daniel alone seemed to notice. And yet, those cracks were enough to make his mind spiral. Why did she keep turning away? Who was she texting so often, even here in the middle of nowhere? Why did her laughter seem different, thinner, as though it carried a secret he wasn't part of? That night, as he lay beside her in the cabin's quiet darkness, Daniel couldn't sleep. He could hear her steady breathing, the calm rhythm of someone at peace, but his own thoughts churned violently. He replayed the moments of the day over and over in his head. The smile at the phone, the distracted gaze, the way her hand had pulled away too quickly. They were small, almost invisible to anyone else, but together they painted a picture that unsettled him deeply. He had planned this trip to remind them both of love and loyalty, yet instead it seemed to be unearthing something hidden, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for its moment to show. As Daniel stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind whisper through the pines outside, one thought began to take root inside him. The anniversary trip wasn't just about celebration anymore. It was about observation. Something was different about his wife, something she wasn't saying, and Daniel realized that if he truly wanted to understand what was happening, he would need to pay closer attention. The perfect getaway he had envisioned was already slipping into something else entirely, a stage where truths, however dark, would inevitably come to light. The air around the cabin had shifted by the third day of their anniversary trip. What had begun with laughter and tender moments now carried a faint weight, like the stillness before a storm. Daniel had noticed the small signs, her late-night phone use, the distracted smiles, the sudden way she pulled away from his touch, but he had convinced himself that maybe he was imagining things. Maybe stress or distance had just crept between them in subtle ways. Yet that morning, as he watched his wife step out onto the porch with her coffee, he couldn't ignore the sense that something was unfolding right in front of him, something he wasn't meant to see. He lingered inside. Hidden just beyond the edge of the curtain, his eyes fixed on her. She wasn't simply sipping her coffee and watching the view, she was on the phone again. Her voice was soft, almost too soft, but even from a distance, Daniel could feel the intimacy of her tone. She laughed at something, a low, warm laugh that didn't sound like the laughter she shared with him. His heart clenched in his chest, and suddenly the cabin that once felt like a sanctuary seemed more like a stage where secrets were being played out. He strained to catch words, but her voice was little more than a murmur, fragments carried off by the wind. When she ended the call, her smile lingered longer than it should have, and Daniel knew in his gut it wasn't a conversation she would ever share with him. Later that afternoon, the tension grew harder to ignore. They went for a walk by the lake, a place Daniel had imagined would be perfect for photos and long, romantic conversations. Instead, his wife kept her phone close, holding it as if it were more essential than the moment they were living. Daniel tried to engage her, pointing out the way the sunlight sparkled across the water, the way the trees bowed over the shore as though protecting its beauty. She nodded, smiled faintly, but her eyes flicked to her screen whenever it lit up. He felt himself shrinking inside, every buzz and vibration of that device cutting into him deeper than words ever could. It wasn't just distraction, it was distance, an invisible wall that left him on the other side. That evening, Daniel's suspicions moved from quiet unease to undeniable realization. They were preparing dinner together, chopping vegetables side by side in the small kitchen. Her phone buzzed again, and without hesitation, she set down the knife, wiped her hands quickly, and picked it up. He caught the look on her face before she turned away, the same smile he had seen on the porch earlier. It was private, intimate, meant for someone else. His chest tightened as his mind raced, and before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "Who are you always smiling at?" The question hung heavy in the air. She froze, her fingers hovering above the screen, and for a moment she looked caught, like a child exposed in a lie. But then she laughed lightly, brushing it off. "Just work," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. "You know how it is." But Daniel did know how it was, and that answer wasn't enough. He recognized the way she avoided his eyes, the way her smile faltered too quickly, the way her hands moved faster as though hoping the conversation would vanish if she kept busy. That night his doubts crystallized into something darker. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't stress. Something real was happening, something she didn't want him to know. He couldn't let it go. While she showered later that night, Daniel sat in the dim glow of the fire, his thoughts a storm. He glanced at her phone on the table, his heart pounding as he debated. Trust had always been their foundation, but wasn't trust already broken if she was hiding? His hands trembled as he reached for it, knowing it was a line he had never crossed before. The screen lit up in his hand, and the notification that appeared was like a knife twisting in his chest. A message, simple but damning. "I miss you already." The words swam before his eyes. His stomach churned and his chest felt like it might cave in. There was no work email, no casual friend behind those words. This was intimacy, this was closeness, this was betrayal disguised as secrecy. He scrolled, each message unraveling the reality he had believed in. Flirtatious exchanges, late-night confessions, the kind of conversations reserved for lovers. His heart cracked with every word he read, and yet he couldn't stop. It was like watching his life collapse in slow motion, powerless to look away. When she stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, Daniel quickly set the phone back down, his face a mask of calm that didn't match the storm inside him. She smiled at him, that same casual smile she had worn all trip, and he wondered how she could look him in the eye while carrying someone else in her heart. The cabin suddenly felt suffocating, its walls too close, the silence too heavy. For the first time, Daniel realized that the perfect anniversary trip wasn't a celebration at all. It was an unveiling, a peeling back of layers that exposed the truth he had never imagined. That night, as she drifted off to sleep beside him, Daniel lay awake, his mind sharp and restless. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was fact, carved into his memory with the words he had read. His chest ached with pain, but beneath the hurt something colder began to form. If this trip had been designed to expose her dark side, then perhaps it was also meant to awaken his own. The discovery weighed heavily on Daniel, but the true depth of betrayal didn't fully strike him until the 4th day of their trip. The messages had already confirmed what he feared. His wife was hiding another relationship. Yet what unsettled him most wasn't just the intimacy of the words. It was the familiarity of the sender's name. The contact wasn't saved under anything suspicious, no disguised alias or random initials. It was a name he recognized, one that stopped him cold the moment his eyes registered it. It was Ryan, Daniel's younger brother. The world seemed to tilt beneath him as he sat staring at the glowing screen. His mind replayed every memory of Ryan, the boy he had grown up protecting, the man he had shared secrets and dreams with, the one person he trusted almost as much as himself. If betrayal by his wife felt like a dagger to the chest, betrayal by his own brother felt like poison running through his veins. It wasn't just infidelity, it was treachery within the bloodline, a fracture in the foundation of family itself. Daniel's hands shook as he scrolled, each line of conversation pulling him deeper into a reality he couldn't comprehend. The messages weren't vague or ambiguous. They were raw, shameless, filled with promises and emotions that should have belonged to Daniel alone. Ryan's words dripped with confidence, as though he had no fear of being discovered. "Last night was all I could think about. I can't wait until this trip is over so I can see you again." And the worst one, the one that lodged itself into Daniel's chest like a blade. "He doesn't satisfy you like I do, does he?" Daniel's breath caught, his vision blurring with rage and disbelief. Every ounce of preparation he had poured into this anniversary trip, the wine, the cabin, the memories, was mocked by these words. His wife wasn't here to celebrate love. She was here to endure time with him while longing for the man he thought he could trust more than anyone. And not just any man, his own brother. The betrayal burned hotter with every passing second, his body trembling with the effort of holding it in. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but the thought of seeing her lie again, of watching her eyes dart away, filled him with disgust. That evening, Daniel studied her closely. Every laugh, every smile, every casual touch felt rehearsed now, tainted by the knowledge of who truly occupied her thoughts. She excused herself to step outside for fresh air, and though she carried her phone with her, Daniel didn't need to follow. He already knew who she was reaching out to. His chest felt hollow, his heart breaking in silence as the crack of betrayal echoed louder than the chirping of the crickets outside. What struck Daniel most wasn't just the infidelity, but the audacity. His brother lived only a short drive away from their home. Ryan had been at their wedding. He had toasted to their love. He had sat at Daniel's table countless times, laughing with them, blending seamlessly into the fabric of their life. And all the while, he had been weaving himself into Daniel's wife's heart, taking what was never his to claim. The betrayal now had two faces. one belonging to the woman Daniel had loved with every fiber of his being, and the other to the brother he had once believed would stand beside him in every storm. The realization cut deeper than words could capture. This wasn't just a broken vow. It was a conspiracy of deceit. That night, when she finally slipped into bed beside him, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts darker than they had ever been. Every sound of her breathing felt like an intrusion. Every shift of the mattress a reminder of the body she had shared with someone else, his own blood. Rage pulsed through him like fire, but it wasn't reckless rage. It was cold, sharp, deliberate. He understood in that moment that this trip wasn't an escape from reality. It was a revelation, a stage where both of their masks had slipped just enough for him to see the truth. And in the silence of that cabin, Daniel made himself a promise. If betrayal had come from the people he trusted most, then revenge would need to be just as personal, just as devastating. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance. And Daniel intended to make sure that both his wife and his brother understood what it meant to shatter the trust of a man who had given them everything. Daniel had always believed that betrayal was something that happened in other people's lives, the kind of tragedy you heard about in hushed tones or saw play out in dramas. But now, sitting in that dim cabin with the faint crackle of the fire echoing like static in his ears, he understood what it truly felt like. The anger was there, of course, raw, searing, the kind that made his body tremble. But beneath it grew something even more dangerous: clarity. The kind of cold, calculated clarity that stripped away emotion and replaced it with purpose. If his wife and his brother thought they could shatter him, they were mistaken. Daniel wasn't broken. He was sharpening. The first step was silence. He said nothing. He let her smile, let her laugh, let her curl up beside him at night as though everything was normal. He became an observer, watching her every move with an intensity she never noticed. Every glance at her phone, every half-hearted conversation, every moment she slipped away for air, Daniel stored it all. She thought she was clever, hiding her treachery in plain sight, but he had already seen the truth. And the longer he stayed quiet, the more she grew comfortable, oblivious to the storm brewing right beside her. During the day, Daniel began planning. Revenge wasn't something to rush. It wasn't about shouting accusations or storming out. It was about precision, about timing, about making sure that when the blow landed, it destroyed them both in ways they would never recover from. He thought about Ryan, his brother, the smugness in his words, the casual way he had stolen what wasn't his. Daniel imagined his face when the truth came crashing down, and the thought fueled him. This wasn't just about justice. It was about humiliation, about turning their betrayal into their undoing. That night, while his wife showered again, Daniel picked up her phone once more. This time, he didn't just glance at the notifications. He opened the conversation fully, scrolling through weeks of messages. Each word cut him deeper, but it also gave him what he needed: evidence. Screenshots, dates, times. It was all there, a trail of treachery neatly stored in her device. He forwarded everything to himself quietly, his fingers steady despite the chaos in his chest. Every message he saved wasn't just proof, it was ammunition. Once he had gathered the evidence, Daniel began to think about how to use it. Confronting them privately wasn't enough. Secrets like these deserved to be dragged into the light, exposed for what they were. He envisioned the perfect setting, not here in the quiet of the woods where their guilt could be contained, but in front of the people who had once celebrated their love. Friends, family, colleagues, the ones who believed in the image his wife and brother had painted. Daniel wanted their masks to be ripped off in public, the world watching as their perfect little deception crumbled to ash. But to reach that point, he had to remain patient. He tested himself, sitting through dinners with her, listening to her speak about trivial things while his mind mapped every detail of his revenge. He even leaned into the illusion, pretending to still be the doting husband, planning small gestures of affection to keep her unsuspecting. Each touch, each smile, each moment of feigned warmth was a mask he wore. But behind it, his mind was working like a machine. building the trap step by step. The most important part of Daniel's plan was making them feel safe. He knew betrayal thrived in shadows, in the confidence that the truth would never surface. So he gave them exactly what they needed: complacency. He didn't question her when she stepped out with her phone. He didn't press when she seemed distracted. He laughed at her jokes, kissed her forehead, and told her he loved her, even as the words turned to ash in his mouth. And all the while, he planned. Late at night, when she slept beside him, Daniel's mind would run through scenarios. He thought about the exact words he would use when the moment came, the way he would reveal the truth so there was no escape for either of them. He imagined the shock in their eyes, the silence that would fall, the shame that would eat at them long after the words were spoken. It wasn't enough for them to lose him. They needed to lose each other too, to feel the full weight of the destruction they had built together. The trip, once meant to be a symbol of love, had transformed into something far more sinister, a testing ground. Daniel was no longer the man who had arrived full of hope and devotion. That man was gone, buried beneath betrayal. What remained was someone colder, sharper, more dangerous, a man who understood that revenge wasn't about anger but about control. And with each passing day, as his wife unknowingly moved closer to the trap he was building, Daniel felt the power shift. She thought she was in control. Ryan thought he was winning. But Daniel had already decided how their story would end. And when the time came when the trap was finally sprung, it wouldn't just expose their dark side, it would ruin them in ways they never saw coming. Daniel moved with the calm of a man who had rehearsed sorrow until it looked natural. He returned home 2 days after the cabin without a word, slipping back into the rhythms of their life like a ghost wearing a familiar face. The house welcomed him with its usual noises, the hum of the fridge, the scatter of traffic outside, but everything felt different, charged. He sent out invitations for a dinner he called an anniversary thank you to the handful of friends and family who had been there through the good years, the people who had raised their glasses to him and to the image they all believed. He chose the venue carefully. The same restaurant where Ryan had toasted at the wedding, the place where smiles had once seemed sincere. He wanted witnesses, and he wanted the safest place to make them feel the exact shame he had felt. On the night of the dinner, he smiled the way a man smiles when he knows the punchline no one else has heard. His wife arrived in a dress that made her look as if nothing had changed. Ryan sat at the table with casual arrogance, the kind a man wears when he thinks himself untouchable. Glasses clinked, small talk spun, and Daniel let the evening breathe. He accepted the congratulations with an outward warmth that belied the furnace inside. When the appetizers arrived, he said nothing. When the mains were cleared, he said nothing. He let them digest the food, then the conversation, then the complacency he had cultivated in them. Then he stood. The room quieted because Daniel had a way of making quiet feel heavy. He spoke softly at first, about promises and memory, about how fragile trust is until it breaks. People leaned in. His wife's smile faltered. He told them he had prepared a little surprise to mark the occasion, something he thought would remind everyone of the years they had shared. A screen brightened at the front of the room, and his carefully crafted slideshow began. Images of vacations, grainy footage of family barbecues, photos of laughter, and then, like an unforgiving cut, text messages bled across the screen, screenshots clipped with dates and times. The room's air shifted. Phones were lowered. Conversations stopped. He played the messages in chronological order, each one a patient hammer blow, flirtations, plans to meet, casual cruelty disguised as affection. He let the audience read what he had once read alone in the dark. Faces turned, and in the center of the tableau were the two people who had betrayed him, his wife and his brother, who now watched as the life they had woven unraveled in public. Daniel had timed everything to the note of the final revelation, a voice message he had saved, recorded during the trip, where Ryan laughed and said plainly and horribly, "He'll never suspect. He buys everything." The sound of that laughter ricocheted through the room like breaking glass. Shame is a pressure that makes people confess or freeze. His wife covered her mouth. Ryan's face emptied of color. Guests shifted in their seats, some angrily, some disbelievingly. A few whispers turned to questions. Someone asked if there had been a mistake. Daniel let them speak. Then he walked them through the evidence he had collected. Screenshots. Payments traced to dinners and hotels, the times that matched the texts. Even small betrayals that once seemed insignificant, but formed a chain long enough to choke the pretense of innocence. He watched those he loved recoil as if from heat. But Daniel's plan didn't stop at exposure. He had lined every step carefully to ensure they could not simply deny and move on. He had forwarded copies to key people: Ryan's employer, who valued loyalty; his wife's sister, who had been suspicious for months; the close friend who had once advised Ryan about integrity. He had printed the messages and left them on the host's table so anyone could take a copy, and he'd arranged for the restaurant manager, one of his old friends, to discreetly record the evening for safety. The humiliation was surgical. It was public. It was permanent. And it was impossible to unring. When the initial shock passed, the room's energy turned into ragged noise. Accusations, apologies, cries of betrayal. Daniel let them speak, cataloging each excuse like a collector catalogs fine tools. None of them altered the facts. Then he did something they had not expected. He didn't scream. He didn't throw glasses. He didn't demand they beg. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, setting it gently on the table in front of his wife. Inside were the copies of every transaction, every message, every moment she and Ryan had thought private. He placed a second envelope on the table in front of Ryan. Their eyes, once arrogant and then stunned, were now hollow. "You have two choices," Daniel said quietly, and the hush that fell then was not reverence, but the heavy hush of judgment. "You can leave here and try to rebuild in secret, pretending the world doesn't know, or you can own what you did and let this be the end." He wanted them to feel the exact weight of consequence he had carried for nights in that cabin. He wanted them to understand how it felt to be the subject of everyone's pity and scorn. He hoped, cold as it sounded, that their shame would drive a wedge so deep they would never find each other's warmth again. The twist, the last thing he had kept folded until the right moment, was not merely the public exposure, but the way he had already rewritten the ledger of his life. While they argued and apologized and tried to salvage something from the wreckage, Daniel had moved with decisive finality the week before, transferring their joint accounts, securing custody papers, and quietly signing a lease for an apartment across town. He hadn't done it in vindictive haste. He had done it with the precise dignity of a man who intended to survive. He would not beg them to stay. He would not be the broken husband in need of repair. He had taken the power they thought they had stolen and used it to step away. As the night collapsed into shards of thrown napkins and drained wine glasses, Daniel gathered his coat. He looked at his wife once, at Ryan twice, and then out at the faces of the people who had watched him marry and who now watched his life fracture. He felt no triumph, only a cold, steady resolve. He had taken everything they gave him: the betrayal, the humiliation, the brutal knowledge that blood could not be trusted. He had turned it into a map for leaving. He stepped out into the night with the hush of falling rain and the faint smell of smoke from the restaurant's chimneys. And as the door closed behind him, the sound in the room was not the finality he had planned, but the beginning of consequences that would bleed slowly into every day of their lives. He walked toward the car he'd already packed. With the essentials, the few things a man who had been betrayed could carry, knowing that what he left behind was not only a marriage but a life that had been built on lies, and that when morning came they would still be